My name is Sarah Chun. I'm 28 years old. And tonight I'm sitting in a conference room that still smells like arrogance and defeat. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows on the faces of 30 engineers who thought they knew better than a delivery driver with a community college degree. But here's the thing about assumptions. They have a funny way of biting you in the ass when you least expect it. It started 6 months ago when I was delivering Chinese takeout to the TechFlow headquarters on Fifth Avenue. You know, the type of building all glass and steel, designed to make you feel small the moment you walk through those revolving doors. I've been making deliveries there for 3 years, watching the same faces come and go. The same stressed out programmers ordering lo mein at 2 in the morning because they were pulling another all-nighter trying to fix whatever crisis had emerged. That week, I knew their system was broken long before they did. Not because I'm some hidden genius, but because I pay attention. When you're invisible to people, you see things they don't. You hear conversations they think don't matter. You notice patterns in their panic, in their late-night food orders, in the way they talk about problems they can't solve. The delivery app they built was supposed to revolutionize food delivery. Real-time tracking, predictive algorithms, seamless integration with restaurant systems, all the buzzwords that make investors throw money at young men in hoodies. But every night I came there, I watched them struggle with the same issues. Orders disappearing into digital black holes, GPS coordinates that sent drivers to empty parking lots, payment systems that crashed during peak hours. I started keeping mental notes, then actual notes. Not because I planned to do anything with them, but because solving puzzles has always been how my brain works. My mother used to say I could find patterns in spilled rice, and she wasn't wrong. While other kids played with dolls, I was taking apart radios and putting them back together, usually better than before. The night everything changed started like any other. Marcus Rivera, the lead engineer, ordered his usual General Tso's chicken, extra spicy with brown rice instead of white. He always requested I bring it directly to the 14th floor instead of leaving it with security. Said it saved time, but I think he just liked having someone to complain to who couldn't fire him. This system is going to be the death of me. Sarah, he said that night, running his hands through his hair until it stood up in frustrated spikes. We've been working on this routing optimization for 8 months. 8 months. And it still sends drivers in circles. I handed him his food and watched him stare at his computer screen like it had personally offended his ancestors. The code was displayed in multiple windows, a maze of functions and variables that looked chaotic to most people but made perfect sense to me. I've been teaching myself programming for years, late nights at the library, free online courses, whatever I could find. What if the problem isn't the algorithm? I asked quietly. He looked up, surprised. In 3 years of deliveries, I'd never offered technical input. What do you mean? Your routing system assumes all addresses are correct, right? But what if they're not? What if the issue is data validation on the front end? Marcus frowned, clicking through screens faster than I could follow. But I'd seen enough delivery apps to know the pattern. Users input addresses quickly, often incorrectly. The system tries to correct them automatically, but sometimes it's wrong. Sometimes it's catastrophically wrong. You're saying the GPS coordinates are corrupted at input? He asked. I'm saying maybe you're trying to optimize a route to nowhere. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned back to his computer. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up data I couldn't see from where I stood, but I could see his face change. The frustration melted into something else, recognition, maybe even a little embarrassment. Jesus Christ, he whispered. You're right. Look at this. 30% of the addresses in our database have validation errors. We've been trying to optimize routes to locations that don't exist. I shrugged. Happens more than you'd think. People type fast, autocomplete. Fills in wrong streets, apartments' numbers get mixed up. I see it every day. That should have been the end of it. A small insight from someone who'd spent years navigating the real world problems their elegant algorithms couldn't handle. Marcus thanked me I left, and I figured he'd fix the validation issue and move on, but 3 weeks later, he flagged me down again. This time, he looked desperate. "Sarah, can I ask you something? Hypothetically, if you were designing a delivery optimization system, what would you do differently?" I almost laughed. Here was a guy with a master's degree from MIT asking a delivery driver for system architecture advice. But the question was genuine, and I'd been thinking about it more than I cared to admit. Hypothetically, I'd start with the drivers, not the algorithms. You're treating us like variables in an equation, but we're not. We know which restaurants are always slow, which neighborhoods have confusing street layouts, which times of day create traffic bottlenecks your GPS doesn't account for. Your system optimizes for mathematical efficiency, but efficiency isn't always fast. Marcus was taking notes now, scribbling frantically on a napkin. What else? Weather integration that actually works. Your app doesn't account for rainmaking, deliveries slower, or snow blocking certain routes, or heat waves that make drivers need more frequent breaks. Real-time restaurant capacity monitoring, not just whether they're open, but whether they're slammed and running behind. Driver fatigue algorithms that recognize when someone's been working 12 hours and their performance is declining. I was warming up now, ideas flowing faster than I could organize them. Communication systems that let drivers report problems in real time instead of after the fact. Predictive modeling based on historical data, not just current conditions. And, for God's sake, a human override option for when the algorithm is obviously wrong. Marcus stared at me like I'd just solved world hunger. How do you know all this? Because I live it every day. You see code, I see consequences. That conversation should have ended there too. But Marcus was persistent and maybe a little bit desperate. TechFlow was hemorrhaging money on their delivery platform. Customers were frustrated, restaurants were threatening to leave, investors were asking uncomfortable questions. The 30-person engineering team had been throwing solutions at the wall for months, and nothing was sticking. 2 days later, Marcus called me. Not through the app, but on my personal phone, which he'd somehow gotten from the restaurant. "Sarah, I have a crazy idea, and I need you to hear me out." The crazy idea was simple and terrifying in equal measure. Marcus wanted me to consult on their delivery optimization project. Not officially, HR would never approve hiring someone without the right credentials, but as an informal advisor. He'd pay me under the table for my insights, and maybe, just maybe, they could salvage their failing system. I almost said no immediately. The rational part of my brain screamed about how ridiculous it was, how I didn't belong in their world of advanced degrees and venture capital funding. But there was another part of me, the part that had been quietly frustrated for years watching smart people make dumb mistakes, that whispered, "Why not?" "I can't pay you much," Marcus admitted. "Maybe a few hundred a week cash. And it would have to be discreet. After hours, when the team's not around." A few $100s was more than I made in tips most weeks. But it wasn't about the money, not really. It was about being heard, about having my ideas matter for once instead of just being the invisible person who brought food and left. What exactly would I be doing? I asked, looking at our system with fresh eyes. Telling us when we're being idiots. Helping us understand what actually happens in the field versus what we think happens. That night, I stood outside TechFlow's building at 11 p.m., feeling like an imposter. The security guard recognized me from my delivery runs and waved me through without question. Marcus met me at the elevators, looking as nervous as I felt, The 14th floor was different at night. During the day, it buzzed with activity keyboards clicking, phones ringing, conversations overlapping in multiple languages. But now it was quiet. Just the hum of servers and the glow of monitors left running. Marcus led me to his workstation, where 3 large screens displayed what looked like a digital hurricane of code, charts, and error messages. "This is our routing optimization engine," he said, gesturing at the chaos. "It's supposed to be intelligent, learning from patterns and improving over time. But look at these performance metrics." He clicked through screens showing delivery times, customer satisfaction, scores, driver efficiency ratings. Every chart told the same story: a system that was getting worse instead of better. "Your machine learning model is training on bad data," I said after studying the displays for a few minutes. Marcus looked confused. "What do you mean? Garbage in, garbage out?" "Your algorithm is learning from historical data that includes all the same problems you're trying to solve. Late deliveries, wrong addresses, inefficient routes. It's all being fed back into the system as normal behavior. The AI isn't getting smarter. It's getting better at being wrong." I moved to his keyboard, hesitating for a moment before starting to navigate through their interface. The system was more complex than anything I'd worked with, but the underlying logic was familiar. Data flowed in, got processed, produced outputs. The devil was in the details. "Here," I said, pointing to a section of code. "This function calculates estimated delivery time based on distance and traffic, but it doesn't account for restaurant preparation time, and it uses average traffic data instead of real-time conditions. So if McDonald's is running behind, or there's an accident blocking Main Street, the estimate is wrong from the start." Marcus leaned over my shoulder, following my reasoning. "But we do pull real-time traffic data from Google." "You pull it, but you don't weight it properly. A 15-minute delay due to construction isn't the same as a 15-minute delay due to rush hour traffic. One is predictable and consistent, the other is variable and likely to clear up. Your algorithm treats them identically." We worked until 3 in the morning, with me pointing out issues and Marcus taking notes. I felt like a translator, converting real-world experience into language his system could understand. When I finally left that night, my head was spinning. With possibilities. This became our routine. 3 nights a week, after my regular delivery shift ended, I'd go up to the 14th floor and dissect their system piece by piece. Marcus was a quick learner and, surprisingly, had no ego about accepting input from someone without his credentials. Maybe desperation had made him humble, or maybe he was just smarter than his colleagues. Within 2 weeks, we'd identified dozens of fundamental flaws in their approach. The routing algorithm prioritized mathematical efficiency over practical reality. The user interface made it easy for customers to input incorrect information. The communication system between drivers, restaurants, and customers was fragmented and unreliable, but identifying problems was easier than solving them. TechFlow's system was a massive, interconnected web of code that had been built over years by dozens of different programmers. Changing one thing often broke 3 others. Every improvement we made seemed to reveal 2 new issues. "We need to rebuild this from scratch," I told Marcus one night, frustrated after spending 4 hours trying to fix a cascading error that our latest update had triggered. "That's not an option," he replied, rubbing his eyes. "We've got investors breathing down our necks and contracts with major restaurant chains. The system has to work with what we've got." That's when I had the idea that would change everything. "What if we didn't rebuild the whole system?" I said slowly, the concept forming as I spoke. "What if we built a parallel intelligence layer that sits on top of your existing code? Something that intercepts decisions before they reach the main system and corrects them in real time." Marcus stopped typing and turned to look at me, like a smart rapper. "Exactly. Your core system continues to function normally, but this overlay catches obvious errors, applies real-world logic, and feeds corrected information back into the flow. It wouldn't require rewriting millions of lines of code, just adding intelligence. IT decision points. The more we talked about it, the more excited Marcus became. This could work. This could actually work without requiring approval from management or massive system overhauls. We could build it quietly, test it on a small scale, and prove its effectiveness before anyone knew it existed. That night marked the beginning of the most intense 6 weeks of my life. Building the intelligence layer turned out to be like performing surgery on a patient who's running a marathon. Every change we made had to be carefully implemented without disrupting the existing system that was processing thousands of orders every day. Marcus handled the deep technical integration while I focused on the logic engines, the decision trees that would determine when to override the original system and what corrections to apply. We started with address validation since that was the most obvious and frequent source of errors. I wrote algorithms based on my years of experience navigating the city's confusing street layouts, apartment complexes, and business districts. The system learned to recognize when GPS coordinates didn't match the actual address format, when apartment numbers were likely typos, when street names were close but incorrect. Marcus was amazed by how much intuitive knowledge I had that their sophisticated geolocation services lacked. You know that the GPS coordinates for Central Plaza apartments always route drivers to the backloading dock instead of the front entrance, he said one night, watching me code another exception rule. Every delivery driver knows that, I replied. But nobody ever asked us. Next came restaurant integration. I built modules that tracked preparation times, not just for individual restaurants, but for specific menu items during different hours and days of the week. Friday night pizzas take longer than Tuesday lunch sandwiches. The original system treated all orders identically, but reality was far more nuanced. The most challenging part was driver behavior modeling. How do you teach an algorithm to recognize when a driver is having an off day, when they're unfamiliar with an area, when they're dealing with vehicle problems that aren't reflected in their GPS location? I drew on my own experience and observations from years in the field, creating decision matrices that accounted for human variables their mathematical models ignored. This is incredible, Marcus said after testing an early version of our overlay. Delivery accuracy improved by 37% in the first week, and customer satisfaction scores are up 22%. But our secret project couldn't stay hidden forever. Other engineers started noticing the improvements and asking questions. Why were certain routes suddenly more efficient? How were address validation errors dropping so dramatically? Marcus did his best to deflect, claiming he'd made some minor optimizations to existing algorithms, but his colleagues weren't stupid. The confrontation came on a Thursday night in late November. I just arrived for our usual session when Marcus met me at the elevator with a grim expression. "We have a problem," he said. "Jake Morrison knows something's up." Jake Morrison was TechFlow's chief technology officer, a brilliant programmer in his early 30s who'd built his reputation on solving impossible technical challenges. He was also known for his ego and his intolerance for anyone who questioned his methods. "How much does he know?" I asked, enough to be suspicious. "He's been analyzing the performance improvements and can't figure out how they're happening. He knows the gains are too significant to be from minor tweaks, but he can't find evidence of major code changes." We decided to continue working, but with extra caution. I started using the freight elevator and entering through a side door to avoid the main security desk. Our sessions became shorter and more focused. But it was too late for stealth. 3 nights later, Jake Morrison was waiting for us when we arrived on the 14th floor. He was younger than I'd expected, with the kind of casual confidence that Comey's from being the smartest person in most rooms. His eyes moved between Marcus and me with obvious suspicion. "So, this is your secret consultant," he said, his voice carrying just enough disdain to make his opinion clear. "A delivery driver?" Marcus started to explain, but Jake cut him off with a raised hand. "I've been reverse engineering your improvements." Rivera, very impressive work. The address validation algorithms are particularly elegant. The restaurant integration modules show sophisticated understanding of operational variables. This level of optimization should have taken our entire team months to develop. He turned his attention to me, studying my face like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve, which makes me curious about how a community college dropout with no formal training in computer science managed to architect solutions that stumped 30 professional engineers. The insult stung, but I kept my expression neutral. I'd dealt with condescending customers for years. This was just another variation on a familiar theme. "Maybe," I said carefully, "your 30 professional engineers were solving the wrong problems." Jake's smile was sharp and humorless. "Is that so? Please enlighten us. What were we doing wrong?" This was the moment I'd been dreading since our project began. I could back down, apologize for overstepping, and return to my delivery routes. Or I could stand my ground and risk everything. "You were building a system for the world you wanted to exist instead of the world that actually exists," I said. "Perfect users who input perfect data, restaurants that operate like clockwork, drivers who follow GPS instructions without question, traffic patterns that match historical averages. But the real world is messy and unpredictable, and your elegant algorithms couldn't handle the chaos." Jake's expression darkened. "And you think you understand system architecture better than people who've spent years studying it?" "I think I understand delivery better than people who've never done it." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into his desk chair. Jake stared at me with a kind of cold, analytical gaze that made me feel like a bug under a microscope. "Prove it," he said finally. "What?" "If you're so confident in your abilities, prove it. Tomorrow night, 7 p.m., conference room, CL. Present the current system performance metrics to the entire engineering team. You can present your improvements. We'll let them decide which approach is better." My heart started racing. This wasn't what I'd signed up for. I was comfortable working quietly with Marcus, but presenting to a room full of professional engineers. People who'd spent years earning degrees I didn't have, working at companies I'd never heard of. But Jake's challenge was also an opportunity. A chance to prove that insight mattered more than credentials, that understanding the problem was more valuable than prestigious educational backgrounds. "Fine," I heard myself saying. "Tomorrow night." Jake's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Excellent. I'll make sure everyone knows that our mysterious performance improvements came from—" He paused dramatically. A delivery driver who thinks she's smarter than us." After he left, Marcus and I sat in stunned silence. "You don't have to do this," he said finally. I can tell him it was my work. Take full responsibility. I shook my head. "No, he's right about one thing. It's time to prove what we've built actually works." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, preparing for the most important presentation of my life. Everything I'd learned about their system, every improvement we'd made, every insight I'd gained from years of deliveries, it all had to be distilled into a compelling argument that would convince a room full of skeptics thought the irony wasn't lost on me. 6 months ago, I was just another invisible service worker bringing food to people who barely acknowledged my existence. Now I was about to defend my ideas in front of the same people who had been struggling with problems I'd solved. Marcus texted me at 6 a.m., conference room booked. Word is spreading. Half the company wants to see this. Great, no pressure. I spent the day going through my normal delivery routine, but my mind was elsewhere. Every successful delivery, every smooth navigation around traffic, every correct address it, all felt like evidence I could use. This was my expertise, gained through thousands of hours of real-world experience. At 6:45 p.m., I stood outside TechFlow's building, wearing the best clothes I owned, a navy blazer I bought for job interviews, and dress pants that actually fit. My laptop bag felt heavier than usual, weighted with the presentation that would either validate everything I'd been saying or humiliate me in front of people who already doubted my credibility. The conference room is packed. I recognized some faces from my delivery runs, but most were strangers. 30 engineers, just like Jake had said, plus several people in suits who looked like management. They all turned to stare when I walked in, and I caught fragments of whispered conversations. That's her? The delivery driver? This should be interesting. Jake stood at the front of the room with a laptop connected to a large display screen. He looked completely at ease, like a professor about to lecture undergraduate students. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice carrying easily through the room. "As you know, we've seen some unusual improvements in our delivery platform over the past few weeks. Tonight, we're going to examine those improvements and their source." He clicked through slides showing performance metrics, delivery times, accuracy rates, customer satisfaction scores. The improvements were undeniable and impressive. "These gains are significant," Jake continued. "The kind of optimization we'd normally expect from months of dedicated team effort, but they appeared gradually without any major code deployments or system overhauls." More slides, diving into technical details. I watched the faces in the room, seeing recognition and confusion in equal measure. They knew their system had gotten better, but they couldn't figure out how. After investigation, I discovered that these improvements came from unauthorized modifications to our core algorithms. Modifications made by, he paused for effect, someone with no formal training in software engineering, no computer science degree, and no previous experience in system architecture. The room buzzed with murmurs. A few people turned to look at me with undisguised curiosity. So tonight, we're going to evaluate these modifications objectively. First, I'll present the technical details of what was changed. Then our consultant will explain her reasoning. Jake's presentation was thorough and professional. He'd reverse engineered most of our intelligence layer, identifying the key components and analyzing their impact. He gave credit where it was due. The improvements were real and substantial, but his tone remained skeptical throughout, emphasizing the unconventional nature of the solutions and questioning their long-term stability. When he finished, the room was quiet. Then he looked at me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sarah, would you like to explain your approach?" I stood up, my heart pounding. 30 pairs of eyes focused on me, waiting to see if the delivery driver could actually justify her presumption. 6 months ago, I began. I was delivering Chinese food to this building and watching you all struggle with the same problems night after night. Orders getting lost, drivers going to wrong addresses, customers complaining about late deliveries. I started paying attention because that's what you do when you're invisible. You notice things other people miss. I moved to the front of the room, connecting my laptop to the display system. My hands were steady despite my nerves. The fundamental issue with your original system wasn't technical sophistication, it was assumptions. You assumed users would input accurate data, restaurants would operate predictably, drivers would follow optimal routes, and traffic would behave according to historical patterns. But assumptions aren't reality. My first slide showed a map of the city with delivery routes highlighted in different colors. Red routes represented failed deliveries, yellow represented delays, Green represented successful on-time deliveries. This is what your original algorithm produced, I said. Mathematically optimal routes that failed in practice because they didn't account for real-world variables. I clicked to the next slide, showing the same map, but with my corrected routes. Overlaid in blue, this is what happens when you incorporate field knowledge. The blue routes are longer in terms of pure distance, but faster in terms of actual delivery time because they avoid known bottlenecks, account for restaurant preparation, delays, and use driver-friendly navigation. A hand went up in the audience. How did you know about these bottlenecks and delays? Asked a woman I didn't recognize. Because I drive these routes every day. I know that the intersection at 5th and Main backs up during evening rush hour. I know that Pizza Palace always runs 20 minutes behind on Friday nights. I know that the GPS coordinates for Riverside Apartments route you to the wrong entrance. This isn't secret information, it's just information nobody thought to collect. From people who actually do the job. More hands went up. Questions about methodology, scalability, technical implementation. I answered as best I could, drawing on weeks of intense work with Marcus and years of practical experience. Then Jake raised his hand. This is all very interesting, he said, but field knowledge isn't scalable. You can't hire delivery drivers to optimize every city, every route, every restaurant. Software engineering is about creating systematic solutions that work everywhere, not one-off fixes that depend on local expertise. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. The core challenge to everything I'd been arguing. You're absolutely right, I said. You can't hire local experts for every market, but you can build systems that learn from them. I clicked to my final slide, showing the architecture of our intelligence layer. This isn't just about my knowledge of this city. It's about creating algorithms that can identify and incorporate local patterns automatically. The system I built with Marcus doesn't just use my insights, it learns from them and applies similar reasoning to new situations. The room erupted in discussions as I explained the adaptive learning mechanisms we'd built into the intelligence layer. Engineers leaned forward in their chairs, asking detailed questions about implementation, scalability, and performance metrics. Even Jake looked intrigued, though he tried to hide it behind his skeptical expression. The key innovation, I continued, isn't any single algorithm, it's the meta-learning framework that identifies when local knowledge trumps global optimization. For example, if drivers consistently deviate from suggested routes in a particular area, the system investigates why instead of just flagging it as non-compliance. A bearded engineer near the back raised his hand. Can you give us a specific example of how this works in practice? I pulled up a case study I'd prepared. 3 weeks ago, your original system was routing drivers to Brookside Mall through the main entrance on Maple Street. Mathematically, it was the shortest path from most restaurants. But drivers kept taking a longer route through the service. Entrance on Oak Street. Your system interpreted this as inefficiency and kept pushing the Maple Street route. The display showed both routes on a map with timing data overlaid. My intelligence layer investigated the pattern and discovered that the Maple Street entrance has a traffic light with a 90-second cycle during peak hours, while the Oak Street entrance has a stop sign. The longer route was actually faster because drivers weren't waiting at the light. Once the system learned this, it started suggesting the Oak Street route, and delivery times in that area improved by 12%. A woman in the front row nodded appreciatively. That's exactly the kind of local optimization we've been struggling with. But how do you scale that insight to other malls in other cities? Pattern recognition, I replied. The system now looks for similar situations, cases where drivers consistently choose longer routes, near large retail complexes. It identifies potential traffic control differences and tests whether the driver preference is actually more efficient. It doesn't just apply the Brookside Mall solution everywhere, but it knows to look for analogous patterns. Jake stood up, commanding attention. This is all very impressive as a proof of concept, but there are serious concerns about code quality, maintainability, and system integration. This overlay layer was built by someone with no formal software engineering training. How do we know it won't introduce bugs or security vulnerabilities? Several engineers nodded in agreement. This was the credentialism argument I've been expecting, the idea that formal education was necessary for reliable software. Development. Marcus cleared his throat from his seat near the window. I'd forgotten he was there, but now he stood up with a determined expression. I've been working closely with Sarah for 6 weeks, he said. I've reviewed every line of code she's written. Her programming style is unconventional, but it's clean, well-documented, and thoroughly tested. She writes better comments than half our senior developers, and her error handling is more comprehensive than most of the legacy code in our main system. He clicked his laptop, and a new slide appeared showing code quality metrics. These are static analysis results comparing Sarah's modules to equivalent sections of our existing code base. Lower complexity, higher test coverage, fewer potential bug vectors. By every objective measure, her code is more maintainable than what we had before. Jake's jaw tightened. Code quality isn't just about metrics. It's about following established patterns, using industry best practices, maintaining consistency with existing architecture. We can't have cowboy coding just because it happens to work. You're right, I said, stepping forward. Consistency and best practices matter, but so does actually solving the problems you're trying to solve. Your existing architecture couldn't handle the challenges of real-world delivery logistics, no matter how well it followed established patterns. I clicked to a comparison slide showing before and after performance metrics. These improvements didn't happen because I ignored best practices. They happened because I focused on the right problems. Your team spent months optimizing database queries and improving server response times, but 90% of delivery delays were caused by factors outside your system entirely. Restaurant prep times, traffic conditions, address validation errors problems that couldn't be solved with better code architecture. A gray-haired man in a suit, whom I recognized as one of the executives, raised his hand. Sarah, this is all very impressive, but I have to ask, why didn't our engineering team identify these issues? We have some of the brightest minds in the industry working on this platform. The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could see Marcus tensing up, waiting for my response. Jake looked smug, as if he expected me to fumble the answer and prove his point about my lack of qualifications. But this was the question I've been thinking about for months, the core issue that had driven me to get involved in the first place. Because bright minds and real-world experience are different things, I said finally. Your team is incredibly talented at solving complex technical problems, but they've never had to explain to an angry customer why their pizza is cold, or figure out how to find apartment 4B in a building where half the numbers are missing, or deal with a restaurant that claims they never received an order that your system says was delivered successfully. I looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. The problems with your system weren't technical problems, they were understanding problems. You built an elegant solution for a simplified version of reality, but reality is messy and unpredictable. It doesn't matter how sophisticated your algorithms are if they're optimizing for the wrong variables. The executive nodded slowly. So what you're saying is that our technical expertise wasn't the limiting factor. It was our domain knowledge. Exactly. You hired brilliant programmers and told them to solve delivery logistics. But you never talk to people who actually do delivery logistics. It's like trying to design an airplane without consulting pilots. You might create something that's technically impressive, but it won't fly well in real conditions. Jake shook his head dismissively. That's an oversimplification. Software engineering is about creating abstractions that work across multiple domains. We can't become experts in every field we build systems for. You don't have to become experts, I replied, but you have to listen to the people who already are experts. The drivers, the restaurant staff, the customers, they understand the problem domain better than anyone. Their insights should inform your technical solutions, not be ignored because they don't have computer science degrees. The room fell quiet for a moment. I could see people processing the argument, weighing the philosophical implications against their professional training and experience. Finally, a young engineer near the middle of the room raised her hand. What would you recommend for future projects? How do we incorporate this kind of domain expertise into our development process? This was the question I'd been hoping someone would ask. The whole point of this confrontation wasn't just to defend my specific contributions, but to suggest a better way forward. Part 6, start with the people who live with your system every day, I said, energized by the question. Not just end users giving feedback on features, but the people whose jobs depend on your software working correctly. They see failure patterns you'll never catch in testing environments. I pulled up a new slide showing the proposed development methodology. Before you write a single line of code, spend time in the field. Shadow drivers during rush hour. Work a shift at a busy restaurant. Handle customer service calls when orders go wrong. Understand the pain points from every angle, not just the technical specifications. The young engineer who'd asked the question nodded enthusiastically. Several others were taking notes. Then bring that field knowledge into your development process. Not as an afterthought during user acceptance testing, but as a core requirement during system design. Create feedback loops that capture operational insights in real time, not just error logs and performance metrics. Jake crossed his arms. That sounds nice in theory, but it's not practical for most development projects. We can't send our entire engineering team to work delivery shifts before building every feature. You don't need to send everyone, I replied. But you need to send someone. And you need to create structures that value operational knowledge as much as technical knowledge. Right now, your system treats driver input as noise to be filtered out. It should be treating it as signal to be amplified. I clicked to my final slide, showing the organizational changes I thought would prevent similar problems in the future. Embed field experts in your development teams, not as consultants who get called in occasionally, but as permanent team members who understand both the domain and the technology. Create career paths that value practical expertise alongside formal education. Build bridges between the people who design systems and the people who use them. The executive in the suit leaned forward. Are you proposing that we hire delivery drivers as software engineers? I'm proposing that you hire people who understand the problems you're trying to solve and then teach them the technical skills they need to solve them. Or hire technical people and make sure they really understand the problem domain. Either approach works, but you can't have one without the other. A heated discussion broke out across the room. Engineers debated the feasibility of integrating field knowledge into development processes. Some argued for more comprehensive user research. Others pushed back on the practical constraints of project timelines and budgets. I watched the conversation unfold, realizing that I'd started something bigger than just defending my specific contributions. After 20 minutes of debate, Jake called for quiet. This has been a fascinating discussion, he said, his tone more neutral than before. But we still need to address the immediate question of what to do with these unauthorized system modifications. Do we integrate them into our main code base? Or do we revert to the original algorithms and pursue improvements through proper channels? The room fell silent again. This was the moment of truth. Would they accept my work based on its results, or reject it based on how it was created? Marcus stood up again. I vote to integrate. The performance improvements are undeniable. The code quality is solid, and we've already proven it works in production. Rejecting it now would be throwing away 6 weeks of progress because we're uncomfortable with how it was created. Several engineers voiced agreement. Others looked uncertain, glancing between Jake and me as if trying to read the political dynamics at play. The gray-haired executive raised his hand for silence. Before we make any decisions, I'd like to hear from Sarah about her long-term intentions. Are you interested in transitioning from delivery work to software development? The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on defending my existing contributions that I hadn't seriously considered what came next. I ... I started, then paused to collect my thoughts. I love solving problems. Whether that's finding the fastest route through downtown traffic or figuring out why an algorithm isn't working correctly. But I also know I have a lot to learn about professional software development, team collaboration, project management, all the things you don't pick up from teaching yourself to code at night. Would you be interested in learning? He pressed. I looked around the room at 30 people who represented everything I'd never had access to: formal education, professional mentorship, resources for large-scale development. 6 months ago, the idea of working alongside them would have seemed impossible. Yes, I said simply, I would. Jake shook his head. This is exactly the kind of romantic thinking that leads to bad hiring decisions. Technical interviews exist for a reason. Code challenges, algorithm questions, system design problems, they filter out people who can't handle the complexity of professional software development. But she already handled the complexity, said the young engineer who'd been taking notes. She built a sophisticated learning system that solved problems our entire team couldn't crack. Isn't that better than any coding interview? One successful project doesn't prove someone can scale to enterprise-level development, Jake replied. What happens when she has to work with legacy systems written in languages she's never seen? What about database optimization, security protocols, compliance requirements? There's a reason we require computer science degrees and years of professional experience. The debate was getting personal now, with Jake clearly feeling that accepting my work would undermine the value of formal credentials. I understood his position. He'd spent years earning his qualifications, and here I was suggesting they weren't necessary, but I also understood something he didn't. The delivery industry had taught me that credentials only matter if they help you solve real problems. I'd worked with drivers who had perfect safety records but couldn't pass written tests, and others who could recite traffic regulations verbatim but crashed their trucks every few months. You're right about one thing, I said, addressing Jake directly. I don't know database optimization or security protocols or compliance requirements, but I know how to learn, and I know how to ask for help when I need it. More importantly, I know how to recognize when a problem isn't actually what it appears to be. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. 6 months ago, you thought you had a routing optimization problem? You spent months trying to make your algorithms more efficient, hiring consultants to analyze your code architecture, upgrading servers to handle more complex calculations. But the real problem was that you were optimizing routes to the wrong destinations. All the technical sophistication in the world couldn't fix that fundamental misunderstanding. So you're saying formal education is worthless? Jake asked, his voice rising slightly. I'm saying formal education is a tool, not a guarantee. It gives you knowledge and frameworks and ways of thinking about problems, but it doesn't automatically make you right, and it doesn't substitute for understanding the problem you're actually trying to solve. The executive looked at his watch, then at Jake. I think we've heard enough for tonight. Jake, I want you to Prepare a formal recommendation about integrating Sarah's modifications. Include technical assessment, risk analysis, and implementation timeline. Sarah, I'd like you to consider what role you might want to play going forward, assuming we move ahead with integration. As people started filing out of the conference room, several engineers stopped to shake my hand or ask follow-up questions. The young woman who'd been taking notes introduced herself as Amy and said she'd love to discuss my field, research methodologies over coffee sometime, but Jake lingered near the front of the room, shutting down his laptop with deliberate slowness. When most people had left, he approached me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You know, this isn't over, right?" he said quietly. "Even if management decides to integrate your code, you'll still have to prove you can work in a professional environment. Team collaboration, code reviews, project deadlines, client presentations. It's not just about solving interesting puzzles anymore." There was something in his tone that wasn't quite hostile, but wasn't friendly either. Maybe resignation or a grudging acknowledgement of what had happened. "I know," I replied, "and I know I'll make mistakes. Probably lots of them. But I'm willing to learn from people who know more than I do, including you." Jake studied my face for a moment, then nodded curtly and left without another word. Marcus waited until we were alone before letting out a long breath. "Holy shit, Sarah. I can't believe you pulled that off. Did I?" I asked, suddenly feeling the exhaustion of the past few hours. Jake doesn't seem convinced, and he's got a lot of influence here. Jake's ego is bruised because someone without his credentials showed up his entire team. But the results speak for themselves, and management cares more about performance metrics than academic pedigrees. We rode the elevator down in comfortable silence. Outside, the city looked different than it had a few hours earlier. Still the same streets I'd been driving for years, but now they felt like the beginning of something new rather than just familiar territory. "What happens next?" I asked as we reached the lobby. Marcus smiled. "Next, you go home and get some sleep. Tomorrow, you start figuring out whether you really want to be a software engineer or if you just wanted to prove you could solve their problems." I didn't go straight home. Instead, I drove through the city, taking the routes I knew by heart but seeing them with different eyes. Every traffic light, every confusing intersection, every restaurant with complicated parking, they all represented data points that could be captured, analyzed, and used to make systems smarter. For the first time in years, I felt like I was at the beginning of something instead of just treading water. My phone rang at 7. I'd finally fallen asleep around. Free, and the jarring sound pulled me from dreams about code in conference rooms. "Sarah, it's Marcus. Are you awake?" "I am now," I mumbled, trying to clear my head. "Can you come in early today?" "Like, right now? There's been a development." 20 minutes later, I was back in Tekfla's lobby, this time wearing jeans and a hoodie instead of my presentation clothes. The building felt different and daylight less intimidating, more like a place where normal people went to work. Marcus met me at the elevator with 2 cups of coffee and an expression I couldn't read. "Good news or bad news?" I asked. "Both, Jake. Spent the night doing a comprehensive analysis of your code. He found some issues, nothing major, mostly style consistency and documentation standards, but he also found something else." We rode up to the 14th floor, where I could see unusual activity for this early in the morning. Engineers were clustered around workstations, talking in animated voices and pointing at screens. "What's going on?" I asked. Jake discovered that your intelligence layer isn't just improving delivery performance. It's also collecting incredibly valuable data about urban logistics patterns, the kind of information that city planners, retail chains, and transportation companies would pay millions for. Marcus led me to a workstation where Jake was surrounded by printouts and multiple monitors displaying complex visualizations. Sarah, Jake said without looking up. Good, you're here. I need you to explain something. His tone was different from the night before, focused and professional rather than antagonistic. Your routing optimization algorithms generate predictive models for traffic flow, restaurant capacity, and consumer demand patterns. But these models are more accurate than anything I've seen from dedicated urban analytics companies. How is that possible? I looked at the visualizations he was showing me, heat maps of delivery density, time series graphs of restaurant performance, predictive models for peak demand periods. It was my work, but displayed in ways I'd never thought to organize it. I wasn't trying to build predictive models, I said honestly. I was just trying to make deliveries more efficient. But I guess if you're tracking all the variables that affect delivery performance, you end up with a pretty comprehensive picture of how the city actually works. Jake nodded, still studying the data. That's exactly what happened. Your system is essentially performing real-time urban logistics analysis as a byproduct of optimizing individual deliveries. The applications are enormous. He pulled up another screen showing financial projections. If we package this data properly, it could be worth more than the delivery platform itself. Retail location optimization, urban planning consultation, traffic management systems, supply chain analytics. We're looking at potential revenue streams worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I felt a strange mix of pride and unease. I'd built the system to solve practical problems for drivers and customers, not to create new products for corporate clients. But there's a catch, Marcus added. The system only works because it's built on insights from someone who actually understands street-level logistics. Without that domain expertise, it's just another data analytics platform. Jake turned to look at me directly, which brings us to the business proposition. TechFlow wants to offer you a full-time position as Senior Systems Architect for Urban Logistics. It's a new role we're creating specifically around your expertise. I blinked, sure I'd misheard. Senior Systems Architect? But I don't have any official qualifications for that kind of position. You have something better, Jake replied. You have results. And after spending the night analyzing your work, I have to admit that your unconventional approach produces insights our traditional methods missed. He seemed to struggle with the next words. I was wrong last night. Not about the importance of formal education or professional development. You'll still need to learn a lot about enterprise software development. But I was wrong to dismiss your contributions because they came from an unexpected source. The apology felt genuine, if grudging, but there was something else in his expression, respect, maybe, or at least professional acknowledgement. What would the job actually involve? I asked. Marcus pulled up another presentation, this one showing organizational charts and project timelines. Leading a new team focused on real-world system optimization. You'd work with urban planners, logistics experts, and data scientists to identify problems similar to what you solved with our delivery platform. Essentially, you'd be applying your approach to a wider range of challenges. The salary would be... Jake named a figure that was more than I'd made in the past 3 years combined. I sat down heavily in the nearest chair. 3 days ago, I'd been delivering Chinese food and worrying about paying rent. Now they were offering me a senior position at a tech company, working on problems I'd never imagined I could tackle professionally. I need time to think about this, I said. Of course, Marcus replied. But there's something else you should. No, word about last night's presentation is spreading. I've already gotten calls from 3 other companies asking about the delivery driver who revolutionized our system. If you don't take this position, you'll probably have other offers. Soon. Jake nodded. The tech industry talks. Stories about unconventional problem-solving approaches spread fast, especially when they produce measurable results. Whether you stay here or not, your career in software development has already begun. I looked around the office, seeing it through completely different eyes than I had 6 months earlier. The same people, the same desks, the same screens full of code. But now I understood that I could be part of this world instead of just observing it from the outside. Can I ask you something? I said to Jake, last night you were pretty hostile to the idea of hiring someone without formal credentials. What changed your mind? Jake was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. I spent the night trying to find flaws in your work. Not because I wanted to undermine you, but because I genuinely believed that software built by someone without proper training would have fundamental problems. I was looking for proof that my prejudices were correct. He gestured at the screens around us. Instead, I found the most elegant solution to urban logistics optimization I've ever seen. Your code is cleaner than most of our senior developers write. Your algorithms are more sophisticated than what I learned in graduate school. Your documentation is better than our internal standards require. Jake paused, then continued. I realized that I'd been confusing credentials with competence. Formal education is valuable, but it's not the only path to expertise. You found a different way to learn what you needed to know, and you applied it more effectively than people who took the traditional route. It was more of an admission than I'd expected from someone who'd been so dismissive the night before. So, what do you think? Marcus asked. Ready to become a software engineer? The transition from delivery driver to senior systems architect wasn't smooth. Despite Jake's acknowledgement of my technical abilities, there were dozens of professional skills I'd never developed: project management, client presentations, team leadership, budget planning. I made mistakes that probably would have gotten me fired from most companies, but TechFlow seemed committed to helping me succeed. My first major challenge came 3 weeks into the new role. I was leading a team tasked with optimizing supply chain logistics for a major retail chain, and had spent days analyzing their distribution patterns without making any meaningful progress. The problem looked similar to delivery optimization, but something fundamental was different. I think I need to see this in person, I told Jake during our weekly check-in meeting. What do you mean? I mean, I need to visit their warehouses, talk to their drivers, understand how their system actually works instead of just looking at data reports. Jake frowned. That's not typically how we approach client projects. We usually work from the specifications they provide and the data they send us. And how's that been working out? I asked. He looked at the project timeline displayed on his screen, showing that we were already behind schedule with no clear solution in sight. Point taken. But you can't just show up at their facilities unannounced. There are protocols, security, procedures, liability issues. So let's follow the protocols. Set up site visits, arrange interviews, get permission to shadow their operations. It'll take time, but less time than spinning our wheels here. Jake hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with deviating from standard practice. But he'd hired me specifically because my unconventional approach produced results, and our conventional approach wasn't working. Fine, I'll make the calls. 2 days later, I was standing in a warehouse in New Jersey, watching forklift operators navigate between towering shelves of merchandise while supervisors tracked inventory on handheld devices. The scale was overwhelming, millions of items flowing through a complex choreography of sorting, storing, and shipping. But within an hour, I started seeing the same patterns I'd recognized in the delivery system. Inefficiencies that had become normalized, workarounds that masked deeper problems, technology solutions that ignored operational realities. Your inventory management system is optimized for storage efficiency, I told the warehouse manager, a woman named Patricia who'd been running operations for 15 years. But that's creating picking inefficiencies that slow down order fulfillment. Patricia nodded. Tell me something I don't know. We've been complaining about this for months, but the corporate algorithm says this is the optimal layout. Optimal for what? I asked, maximizing storage density. Fitting the most products in the least space. But that's not actually your goal, is it? Your goal is getting products to customers as quickly and accurately as possible. Patricia laughed. Exactly, but try explaining that to the people who designed the system. I spent 3 days at different warehouses talking to everyone from forklift operators to shift supervisors to regional managers. The same story emerged at each location: sophisticated systems that prioritize mathematical optimization over operational effectiveness. When I returned to TechFlow, I had a completely different understanding of the problem. It's not a supply chain optimization challenge, I told my team during our next meeting. It's a priority alignment challenge. The corporate algorithms are optimizing for the wrong metrics. Amy, the young engineer who'd supported me during the conference room confrontation, raised her hand. What do you mean? Their system measures success by storage density, inventory turnover, and transportation costs. But their actual business? Success depends on order accuracy, fulfillment speed, and customer satisfaction. The metrics are misaligned with the objectives. I pulled up data from my warehouse visits showing the disconnect between corporate performance indicators and operational realities. A warehouse can have perfect storage density scores while producing terrible customer outcomes. The system rewards managers for behaviors that hurt the business, then blames them when customer satisfaction drops. Jake leaned forward. So what's the solution? Change the metrics. Instead of optimizing for storage density, optimize for order fulfillment speed. Instead of minimizing transportation costs, minimize total delivery time. Instead of maximizing inventory turnover, maximize customer satisfaction scores. It sounded simple, but implementing it required rebuilding their entire performance measurement system. We spent 2 months creating new algorithms that tracked what actually mattered to their business. Then another month testing them in a pilot warehouse. The results were dramatic. Order fulfillment times improved by 40%. Picking accuracy increased by 30%. Customer satisfaction scores reached all-time highs. But storage density decreased by 12%, and transportation costs increased by 8%. When we presented our findings to the client's executive team, I could see the conflict in their faces. The improvements in customer service were undeniable, but the increases in operational costs triggered concerns about quarterly profit margins. These results are impressive, said their chief operating officer, but we can't ignore the cost implications. Our shareholders expect a continuous improvement in efficiency metrics. This was the moment I realized that solving technical problems was often easier than solving organizational problems. We'd proven that our approach worked better for customers and employees, but corporate incentive structures made it difficult to implement. What if we could prove that improved customer satisfaction leads to higher long-term revenue? I asked. How? Would you do that? Give us 6 months to run parallel systems. Half your warehouses use the existing optimization algorithms, half use our customer-focused approach. We'll track not just operational metrics, but customer retention, repeat purchases, and lifetime value. Let the business results speak for themselves. It was a risky proposition, but the pilot results had been compelling enough to earn their trust. They agreed to the extended trial with the understanding that we'd need to demonstrate clear revenue advantages to justify the higher operational costs. During those 6 months, I learned more about business strategy and corporate decision-making than I'd ever expected. It wasn't enough to build better systems. You had to prove that better systems produce better business outcomes. Technical optimization was meaningless without business optimization. The final results vindicated our approach completely. Warehouses. Using our customer-focused algorithms generated 23% higher revenue per customer, 17% better retention rates, and 31% more positive reviews. The improved customer experience more than compensated for the higher operational costs. But more importantly, the project established a methodology for approaching complex optimization challenges. Start with understanding the real objectives, not just the stated metrics. Spend time with the people who actually do the work, not just the managers who oversee it. Test solutions in real-world conditions, not just theoretical models. By the end of my first year at TechFlow, our team had applied this approach to everything from hospital patient flow optimization to municipal traffic management. Each project taught me something new about the gap between how systems are supposed to work and how they actually work. The success also brought unexpected challenges. Other companies started recruiting me aggressively, offering positions with even higher salaries and more prestigious titles. Tech conferences invited me to speak about unconventional problem-solving approaches. Business magazines wrote articles about the delivery driver who revolutionized system design. The attention was flattering but overwhelming. I'd gone from being invisible to being the center of conversations I wasn't sure I was qualified to lead. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in March, almost exactly 1 year after my confrontation with Jake in the conference room. I was reviewing code for a hospital logistics optimization project when my assistant transferred. A call from someone claiming to represent the Department of Transportation. Miss Chen, this is Director Elizabeth Warren from the Federal Highway Administration. I'd like to discuss a consulting opportunity that might interest you. I assumed it was a sales call. Government contractors often used official-sounding titles to get past corporate gatekeepers. But something in her tone made me listen. We've been following your work on urban logistics optimization, she continued. Particularly your approach to incorporating field expertise into algorithmic decision-making. We have a situation that might benefit from your methodology. An hour later, I was on a video call with 5 federal officials discussing the most complex logistics challenge I'd ever encountered. The interstate highway system was failing, not because of infrastructure problems, but because traffic management systems couldn't adapt to changing usage patterns. Traditional traffic engineering assumes predictable flow patterns, Director Warren explained. Morning rush hour, evening rush hour, weekend leisure travel. But modern traffic is increasingly unpredictable. Remote work, flexible schedules, e-commerce deliveries, ride-sharing services. Our optimization algorithms are designed for a world that no longer exists. She pulled up visualizations showing traffic data from major metropolitan areas. The patterns looked chaotic, with congestion appearing at unexpected times and locations that defied traditional modeling approaches. We've tried upgrading our algorithms, hiring consulting firms, implementing machine learning systems. Nothing works because we're still fundamentally assuming that traffic behaves according to historical patterns. What makes you think I can help? I asked. Because you've solved similar problems before. Your delivery optimization work succeeded because you incorporated insights from people who actually navigate these systems daily. We think the same approach might work for traffic management. The scope was staggering. They were talking about optimizing traffic flow across the entire interstate system, affecting millions of drivers and billions of dollars in economic activity. It was the kind of challenge that major engineering firms spent years failing to solve, but it was also exactly the kind of problem that excited me. Complex, important, and apparently unsolvable using conventional approaches. I'd need to understand how traffic management actually works, I said. Not just the technical systems, but the human elements. Who makes decisions about traffic signals, highway routing, construction scheduling? How do those decisions get implemented? What information do they have access to? Director Warren smiled. That's exactly what we were hoping you'd say. We can arrange for you to spend time with traffic engineers, highway patrol officers, construction supervisors, even truck drivers and commuters. Whatever field research you think would be helpful. 3 weeks later, I was riding in a patrol car with Officer Mike Rodriguez on I-95 during the morning rush hour, watching him navigate traffic, patterns that bore no resemblance to what the official flow models predicted. See that backup at the Meridian Street exit? He said, pointing to a line of brake lights stretching for half a mile. Happens every Tuesday and Thursday around this time. Not Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, just Tuesday and Thursday. Why? There's a community college that runs evening classes on those days. Students leave work early to get to class, but they all take the same route because the GPS apps don't know about the evening class schedule. Creates a bottleneck that the traffic management system never sees coming. I pulled out my notebook and started writing. This was exactly the kind of local knowledge that formal traffic models missed, behavioral patterns that were perfectly logical when you understood the context, but invisible to systems that only tracked aggregate flow data. Over the next 2 months, I rode with dozens of different people, long-haul truckers who knew which way stations caused delays, construction supervisors who understood how roadwork affected traffic patterns, emergency responders who could predict when accidents would create cascading congestion. Each conversation revealed another layer of complexity that existing traffic management systems ignored. School schedules, sports events, weather patterns, seasonal employment changes, local construction projects, all factors that affected traffic flow but weren't incorporated into optimization algorithms. I started building a framework similar to what we'd developed for delivery optimization, but scaled up to handle the complexity of interstate traffic management. Instead of optimizing individual routes, we'd optimize system-wide flow patterns. Instead of learning from delivery drivers, we'd learn from everyone who interacted with the highway system professionally. The pilot project focused on a 50-mile stretch of I-95 that had been experiencing increasingly unpredictable congestion. We installed monitoring systems that tracked not just vehicle counts and speeds, but also the behavioral patterns that influenced traffic flow. The results were immediate and dramatic. By incorporating real-world knowledge about local traffic patterns, construction impacts, and behavioral triggers, we reduced average commute times by 28% and virtually eliminated the kind of unpredictable bottlenecks that had been plaguing the corridor. More importantly, the system learned and adapted. When new patterns emerged, a popular restaurant opening near an exit, a major employer changing shift schedules, a construction project affecting normal routes, the algorithms recognized the changes and adjusted optimization strategies accordingly. 6 months later, I was presenting our methodology to a joint session of Congress, explaining how field expertise could revolutionize infrastructure management at a national scale. The fundamental insight, I told the assembled representatives and senators, is that transportation systems are human systems, not just engineering systems. People make decisions based on factors that pure data analysis can't capture: convenience, habit, local knowledge, personal preferences. If you want to optimize traffic flow, you have to understand human behavior, not just vehicle movement. The questions came fast and thoughtful. Representatives wanted to know about implementation, costs, scalability challenges, privacy concerns, coordination with state agencies. I answered as best I could, drawing on everything I'd learned about the intersection of technology and human behavior, But the most significant question came from a senator I didn't recognize. Miss Chun, your background is unusual for someone testifying before Congress about federal transportation policy. What would you say to critics who argue that complex policy challenges require specialized expertise that can't be gained through unconventional experience? It was the credentialism argument again, but in a different context. Instead of defending my technical qualifications, I was being asked to defend my policy expertise. Senator, I'd say that specialized expertise comes in many forms. I may not have a degree in transportation engineering, but I have something equally valuable direct experience with the gap between how systems are supposed to work and how they actually work. I paused, looking around the room at the faces of people who would decide whether to implement our approach nationally. The most dangerous assumption in policymaking is that existing systems work as designed. They don't. They evolve, adapt, and develop workarounds that formal analysis often misses. Understanding those informal adaptations is crucial for creating policies that solve real problems instead of theoretical ones. The congressional testimony opened doors I never could have imagined. Within weeks, I was fielding calls from agencies across the federal government, Department of Energy wanting to optimize power grid management, Department of Agriculture interested in supply chain resilience, Department of Housing and Urban Development asking about affordable housing distribution strategies. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. Sophisticated technical systems that weren't producing expected results, despite being designed by experts and implemented with substantial resources. The common thread was always the same algorithms optimized for theoretical efficiency that failed in real-world applications. But with opportunity came pressure. TechFlow promoted me to Vice President of Applied Systems Research and assigned me a team of 12 engineers and data scientists. Suddenly, I was responsible not just for solving problems, but for managing people, budgets, and corporate relationships. The management responsibilities were the hardest part of my transition. I've learned to write code, understand complex systems, and present to executives. But I'd never learned to navigate office politics, conduct performance reviews, or make decisions that affected other people's careers. My first major management crisis came when 2 of my team members, both with advanced degrees and years of experience, started pushing back against our field research methodology. Sarah, with all due respect, this approach isn't scalable, said Dr. Michael Patterson, a systems engineer with a PhD from Carnegie Mellon. We can't spend weeks doing ethnographic research for every project. There has to be a way to systematize the insights so we can apply them more efficiently. His colleague, Dr. Jennifer Liu, nodded in agreement. The field research produces valuable insights, but it's too time-intensive and subjective. We need to develop frameworks that capture the essential patterns without requiring extensive on-site investigation. They weren't wrong. Our methodology was producing excellent results, but it was also labor-intensive and difficult to scale. As our client roster grew, the demands for customized field research were becoming unsustainable, but I worried that systematizing our approach too much would eliminate exactly what made it effective: the direct connection between technical solutions and operational realities. What if we're thinking about this wrong? I said during our team meeting. Instead of trying to make field research more efficient, what if we made systems more responsive to field input? Amy, who'd been promoted to lead our algorithmic development, looked up from her laptop. What do you mean? Most systems are designed to be static. You build them, deploy them, and they operate according to fixed parameters. But what if we built systems that could incorporate new field insights continuously without requiring major redesigns? I pulled up a whiteboard and started sketching out the concept. Instead of doing extensive upfront research and then building a system based on those insights, we build systems that can learn from ongoing field input. Drivers, operators, managers, customers, they all become continuous sources of system improvement rather than one-time research subjects. Dr. Patterson frowned. That sounds like you're describing adaptive machine learning, which already exists. Similar concept, but different implementation. Machine learning systems adapt to patterns and data, but they don't understand context or intention. What I'm describing is systems that can incorporate human expertise and contextual knowledge in real time. Over the next 3 months, we developed what we called human algorithmic integration systems, HI systems for short. Instead of trying to capture all relevant field knowledge during initial development, these systems were designed to continuously incorporate insights from people who worked within them. The first HI system we deployed was for a municipal waste management department that had been struggling with route optimization. Traditional approaches had failed because waste collection patterns varied dramatically based on factors that were difficult to quantify, weather effects on bin placement, seasonal variations in waste volume, neighborhood-specific logistical challenges. Our HI system started with basic route optimization algorithms, but included interfaces that allowed drivers and supervisors to provide real-time feedback about conditions the algorithms couldn't detect. When a driver reported that construction was blocking access to certain streets, the system would automatically adjust routes for other drivers. When supervisors noticed patterns in bin overflow or missed collections, they could input observations. That would modify future scheduling. The results exceeded our expectations. Route efficiency improved by 35%, missed collections dropped by 60%, and driver satisfaction increased significantly because they felt their expertise was being valued and utilized. More importantly, the system kept getting better. Unlike traditional optimization algorithms that reached performance plateaus, HI systems continued improving as they incorporated more human insights. This success led to rapid expansion. Within 6 months, we had HAI systems deployed in everything from hospital patient scheduling to airport baggage handling to emergency response coordination. Each implementation taught us something new about the intersection of human expertise and algorithmic optimization, but success also brought scrutiny. Academic researchers began publishing papers questioning the theoretical foundations of our approach. Technology companies complained that our methods were too informal and unscientific. Government auditors worried about the lack of standardized metrics for measuring human input quality. The criticism came to a head during a conference presentation I gave at MIT. I was explaining HI system methodology to an audience of computer science professors and graduate students when a distinguished-looking man in the front row raised his hand. Ms. Chen, your approach seems to assume that human intuition is more reliable than algorithmic analysis. But decades of research in cognitive science demonstrate that human decision-making is subject to systematic biases and errors that algorithms can help eliminate. Aren't you essentially arguing for a return to pre-scientific management methods? The question struck at the heart of what I'd been doing for the past 2 years. Was I actually improving systems, or was I just replacing algorithmic precision with human subjectivity? Professor ... I started realizing I didn't know his name. Davidson. MIT Computer Science. Professor Davidson, I think you're mischaracterizing what HI systems do. We're not replacing algorithmic analysis with human intuition. We're creating feedback loops that allow algorithms to incorporate types of information they can't access independently. I clicked to a slide showing performance metrics from our municipal waste management deployment. Algorithms are excellent at processing quantitative data and identifying mathematical patterns, but they can't understand context, intention, or Qualitative factors that affect system performance. Humans excel at contextual reasoning, but struggle with complex quantitative optimization. HAI systems combine both capabilities instead of choosing between them. Professor Davidson wasn't satisfied. But how do you validate human input? How do you distinguish between valuable insights and uninformed opinions? Without rigorous quality controls, you're introducing noise into systems that could operate more reliably without human interference. This was the question I'd been grappling with since we started developing high systems. How do you maintain scientific rigor while incorporating subjective human knowledge? We validate human input the same way we validate algorithmic output. I replied, through results. If incorporating a driver's insight about traffic patterns improves delivery performance, that insight is validated. If a supervisor's observation about equipment maintenance prevents system failures, that observation is valuable regardless of whether it fits established theoretical frameworks. That's circular reasoning, Professor Davidson responded. You're using performance improvements to justify the methods that produce performance improvements. It's not scientifically rigorous. The audience was getting restless, sensing an academic argument that could continue indefinitely. But Professor Davidson had raised a fundamental question about the validity of our entire approach. You're right that it's not scientifically rigorous in the traditional sense, I admitted. But traditional scientific rigor hasn't been producing systems that work effectively in real-world conditions. At some point, you have to choose between theoretical purity and practical effectiveness. The confrontation at MIT forced me to confront something. I'd been avoiding the question of whether our approach was actually better or just different. Professor Davidson's criticisms stung because they contained elements of truth. High systems were less predictable than traditional algorithms, harder to validate through conventional testing, and more dependent on subjective human judgment, but they also worked better in practice, producing measurable improvements in system performance across dozens of different applications. The tension between theoretical rigor and practical effectiveness was becoming a defining characteristic of our work. I decided to address the criticism head-on by commissioning an independent evaluation of high system performance. We hired a consulting firm with no connection to TechFlow to conduct a comprehensive analysis of our deployments, comparing them to conventional algorithmic approaches using standardized performance metrics. The results took 6 months to compile and cost more than our entire research budget for the previous year. That they provided definitive answers to questions that had been haunting our work. High systems consistently outperformed conventional algorithms across every metric the evaluators tested: efficiency, accuracy, user satisfaction, system reliability, and adaptation to changing conditions. The improvements weren't marginal. They were substantial and consistent across different domains and implementation contexts. More importantly, the evaluation identified why high systems worked better. It wasn't because human intuition was superior to algorithmic analysis, but because human expertise provided types of information that algorithms couldn't access independently: contextual knowledge, pattern recognition based on experience, understanding of system exceptions and edge cases. The report concluded that HAI systems represented a genuine methodological advance, not just a rejection of scientific rigor, but an expansion of what scientific rigor could include. Armed with independent validation, I returned to the academic and professional communities that had been skeptical of our approach. The reception was markedly different. Instead of defensive questions about theoretical foundations, I fielded inquiries about implementation methodology, training requirements, and scaling strategies. But the most significant recognition came from an unexpected source. The MacArthur Foundation called to inform me that I'd been selected as a MacArthur Fellow, a Genius Grant. recognizing exceptional creativity and potential for future contribution. The notification came while I was sitting in my car outside a warehouse in Ohio, preparing for another field research session. I stared at my phone, reading the message 3 times before it registered. 5 years earlier, I'd been delivering Chinese food and struggling to pay rent. Now I was being recognized as one of the most innovative thinkers in the country. The transformation felt surreal, like it happened to someone else. The MacArthur Fellowship brought opportunities I couldn't have imagined. Universities offered visiting professorships, tech companies proposed massive consulting contracts, government agencies invited me to lead national policy initiatives. For the first time since starting this journey, I had more opportunities than I could possibly pursue. I chose to focus on education. If high methodology represented a genuine advance in system design, it needed to be taught to the next generation of engineers, managers, and policymakers. But that meant figuring out how to systematize insights that had emerged from highly individualized experiences. Working with MIT, including Professor Davidson, who'd become a surprising ally after reviewing our independent evaluation, we developed the first formal curriculum in human algorithmic integration. The program combined traditional computer science and systems engineering with fieldwork, ethnographic research, and cross-disciplinary collaboration. The students were unlike anything I'd encountered in traditional engineering programs. They spent as much time talking to bus drivers and factory workers as they did writing code. They learned to recognize when mathematical optimization was producing suboptimal real-world results. They developed skills in translating between technical and operational languages. Most importantly, they learned to question assumptions that technical communities had taken for granted, that formal education was the only path to expertise, that algorithmic solutions were inherently superior to human judgment, that system optimization could be separated from human behavior. The first cohort of HAI program graduates entered the workforce 2 years later. Within months, they were producing the kinds of breakthrough solutions that had taken me years to develop. But they were doing it systematically, with theoretical frameworks and methodological rigor that I'd never possessed. Watching them work, I realized that our approach had evolved beyond my personal experience into something that could be taught, replicated, and improved upon. What had started as individual insights about delivery logistics had become a new field of study with its own literature, conferences, and professional communities. But success also brought responsibilities I hadn't anticipated. As high methodology gained recognition, I became the public face of a movement that was larger than any individual contribution. People looked to me for insights about artificial intelligence, urban planning, organizational psychology, and policy design areas. Where my expertise was limited or non-existent, the pressure to be an expert on everything was overwhelming. I started declining speaking engagements, avoiding media interviews, and focusing on the specific problems I understood best. But the demand for my input continued growing, creating expectations I couldn't meet. The crisis came during a congressional hearing on artificial intelligence regulation. I'd been invited to testify about human-AI collaboration, but the questions quickly expanded to broader issues about algorithmic bias, privacy protection, and economic displacement. Ms. Chun, said Representative Williams from California, "You've argued that human expertise should be integrated into algorithmic systems. But what about situations where human expertise is itself biased or discriminatory? Shouldn't we be using AI to eliminate human prejudice rather than incorporating it into our systems?" It was a fair question that struck at fundamental tensions in high methodology. Human expertise could include valuable insights, but it could also perpetuate systemic inequalities and discriminatory practices. Representative Williams. That's exactly why high systems need to be designed with explicit bias detection and correction mechanisms, I replied. We're not advocating for uncritical acceptance of all human input, but for systematic integration of valuable human insights while filtering out prejudicial assumptions. But who decides what constitutes valuable insight versus prejudicial assumption? Press Representative Williams. Aren't you just replacing algorithmic bias with human bias? I paused, realizing that I was being asked to solve problems that went far beyond my technical expertise, questions about justice, fairness, and social values that couldn't be answered through system optimization alone. Representative, I think? That's exactly the wrong question, I said finally. The choice isn't between human bias and algorithmic bias. Both exist, and both can cause harm. The question is how we design systems that help humans and algorithms check each other's biases and improve decision-making together. Can you give us a specific example of how that would work? I thought about our municipal waste management system, where driver input had improved route efficiency but had also initially reinforced assumptions about which neighborhoods were difficult to serve. In one of our early deployments, drivers were providing input about route optimization that inadvertently reflected assumptions about certain neighborhoods being problematic. The system was learning to avoid those areas, which meant residents received worse service. How did you address that? We built accountability mechanisms into the system. Performance was measured not just by efficiency, but by equity, ensuring that service quality was consistent across all neighborhoods. When the system detected patterns that suggested discriminatory outcomes, it flagged them for human review and correction. So you're saying the solution is more oversight, not less? I'm saying the solution is smarter oversight. Instead of choosing between human judgment and algorithmic analysis, we design systems that help both humans and algorithms make better decisions together. The hearing continued for 3 hours, covering everything from employment displacement to privacy rights to international competitiveness. I answered as thoughtfully as I could, but I left feeling like I'd been asked to provide expertise I didn't possess about problems I didn't fully understand. That night, I called Marcus, who'd remained at TechFlow and was now running their entire optimization division. I think I'm in over my head, I told him. People are asking me to be an expert on things I know nothing about: social policy, economic theory, ethical frameworks. I'm just someone who figured out how to make delivery systems work better, Marcus laughed. Sarah, you're not just someone who figured out delivery systems. You're someone who figured out how to bridge the gap between technical solutions and human reality. That's exactly what these big policy questions need. But I don't have answers to questions about algorithmic bias or economic inequality or international competition. Nobody does. That's why they're asking you. Because you've demonstrated that conventional expertise isn't always sufficient for solving complex problems. And maybe unconventional perspectives can provide insights that traditional approaches miss. Marcus was right, but that didn't make the pressure any easier to handle. Over the next year, I found myself at the center of debates about technology policy, economic transformation, and social justice topics where my technical expertise was relevant but not sufficient. The breakthrough came when I stopped trying to be an expert on everything and started applying high methodology to the problems themselves. Instead of providing definitive answers about AI regulation or economic policy, I began facilitating conversations between different types of experts, technologists, and social workers, economists and community organizers, policymakers, and people directly affected by the policies being discussed. The approach proved surprisingly effective. Just as high systems worked better when they incorporated diverse types of expertise, policy discussions produced better outcomes when they included voices that were usually excluded from technical conversations. I Started organizing what I called integration forums, structured dialogues that brought together people with different types of relevant knowledge to address complex policy challenges. The forums weren't traditional conferences or academic symposiums, but working sessions designed to produce actionable insights from collaborative problem solving. The first integration forum focused on algorithmic bias in hiring systems. Instead of just bringing together AI researchers and policy experts, we included HR managers, job seekers, employment counselors, and civil rights advocates. The conversation was messy and sometimes contentious, but it produced insights that purely technical discussions had missed. The problem isn't just that algorithms replicate historical biases, said Maria Santos, a community organizer from Detroit. It's that they make discrimination invisible. When a human recruiter makes biased decisions, you can confront them, challenge them, maybe change their mind. When an algorithm makes biased decisions, there's no one to hold accountable. Her observation reframed the entire discussion. Instead of focusing solely on improving algorithmic fairness, we started exploring how to maintain human accountability in automated systems. The forum produced specific recommendations that influenced federal guidelines for AI in hiring. But more importantly, it demonstrated that complex policy challenges could benefit from the same integration of diverse expertise that had improved technical systems. Over the next 2 years, integration forums addressed everything from healthcare, AI to smart city planning to automated decision-making in criminal justice. Each forum brought together people who rarely interacted professionally, but whose different perspectives provided crucial pieces of larger puzzles. The work was exhausting, but deeply satisfying. I was finally using my skills to address problems that mattered at a scale I'd never imagined possible. But it was also isolating in ways I hadn't anticipated, that my personal life had been subsumed by professional responsibilities. I worked 70-hour weeks, traveled constantly for speaking engagements and consulting projects, and spent most of my free time reading about policy issues I needed to understand better. The isolation became acute during a forum on rural broadband infrastructure. I was listening to a farmer from Iowa describe how unreliable internet connectivity affected everything from crop monitoring to veterinary consultations, when I realized that I'd lost touch with the kind of ground-level reality that had originally motivated my work. I was talking about human expertise and field knowledge, but I wasn't spending time with the humans or in the fields. I'd become the kind of expert I'd once criticized, someone who understood systems abstractly but had limited direct experience with their practical impacts. That weekend, I drove to a small town in Pennsylvania and spent 3 days working with a delivery service that served rural communities. It was the first time in 2 years that I'd done actual delivery work, and the experience was both nostalgic and revelatory. The challenges were similar to what I'd encountered in urban delivery, but with different constraints and complications. Addresses that GPS couldn't locate, roads that weren't on official maps, customers who needed services that went beyond simple package delivery, but the drivers had developed sophisticated workarounds and informal networks that enabled them to provide effective service despite technological limitations. Their solutions were elegant, practical, and completely invisible to anyone who wasn't directly involved in the work. Spending time with them reminded me why high methodology worked, not because I was particularly insightful, but because people who do complex work develop deep understanding of how to do it better. The challenge was creating systems that could learn from that understanding instead of ignoring it. Return to my policy work with renewed clarity about what I was trying to accomplish. The goal wasn't to become an expert on every aspect of technology policy, but to ensure that policy discussions included the voices of people who would be most affected by the decisions being made. This realization led to the most ambitious integration forum I'd ever organized, a year-long process to develop recommendations for national AI policy. Instead of a single event, it was a series of interconnected dialogues involving hundreds of participants from every sector of society: tech workers and factory workers, teachers and students, doctors and patients, police officers and community. Activists all brought their perspectives to bear on questions about how artificial intelligence should be developed, deployed, and regulated. The process was chaotic and often contentious. People disagreed about fundamental values, priorities, and trade-offs, but the disagreements were productive, forcing participants to articulate their assumptions and consider alternative viewpoints. The final recommendations were more nuanced and comprehensive than anything that could have emerged from traditional policy development processes. They address technical standards, economic impacts, social equity, democratic accountability, and international competitiveness in an integrated framework that recognized the interconnectedness of these challenges. When the recommendations were released, they influenced federal legislation, corporate policies, and academic research agendas. But the most significant impact might have been on the participants themselves, who carried insights from the process into their own professional communities. I was invited to present the Integration Forum methodology to the United Nations, where similar approaches were being considered for addressing global challenges like climate change, economic inequality, and technological governance. Standing at the podium in the UN General Assembly, looking out at representatives from nearly every country in the world, I thought about the journey that had brought me there. 5 years earlier, I'd been an invisible delivery driver who noticed patterns in a broken system. Now I was addressing world leaders about new approaches to global governance, but the core insight remained the same. Complex problems require diverse expertise, and the people closest to the problems often understand solutions that experts miss. The challenge is creating systems that can integrate different types of knowledge instead of privileging some and ignoring others. The future of problem solving, I told the assembled delegates, isn't about replacing human judgment with artificial intelligence or choosing between local knowledge and global systems. It's about creating new forms of collaboration that combine the best of human insight and technological capability. After the presentation, I was approached by delegates from dozens of countries interested in adapting Integration Forum methodology to their own policy challenges. The conversation continued late into the evening, covering applications from urban planning in Singapore to agricultural development in Kenya to education reform in Brazil. But the most meaningful conversation was with a young woman from Bangladesh who was working on flood management systems. Your approach makes perfect sense for technology policy in wealthy countries, she said. But what about situations where the basic infrastructure for these kinds of collaborative processes doesn't exist? Where people are focused on immediate survival rather than long-term system optimization? It was a humbling question that reminded me how much of what I'd learned was dependent on specific contexts and resources. HAI methodology worked well in environments with stable institutions, reliable technology, and educated populations. But could it be adapted to address challenges in very different circumstances? I don't know, I admitted. But I'd like to learn. Would you be interested in collaborating on figuring that out? The collaboration with Dr. Rashida Khatun from Bangladesh opened my eyes to limitations in HAI methodology that I'd never considered. The flood management challenges she described required integrating local knowledge about weather patterns, river behavior, and community resources with technological solutions for early warning systems and emergency response coordination. But the communities most affected by flooding often lacked reliable electricity, internet connectivity, and formal education prerequisites for the kind of human algorithmic integration we developed in wealthy, technology-rich environments. Your systems assume that people can interact with algorithms through computers and smartphones, Dr. Cotton explained during one of our video calls. But what about communities where the primary communication technology is still radio, and most people can't read the dominant written language? Working with her, I began developing what we called appropriate technology integration, ATI systems that could incorporate human expertise through whatever communication channels were actually available and reliable in specific contexts. First, a TI pilot project focused on a river delta region where seasonal flooding affected hundreds of thousands of people. Instead of building systems that required internet connectivity and digital literacy, we developed approaches that worked through existing social networks and communication patterns, local knowledge about flood timing, safe evacuation routes, and resource distribution was collected through community meetings led by respected elders and local leaders. This information was then integrated with satellite weather data and hydrological models to create flood prediction and response systems that could be communicated through radio broadcasts and community messengers. The system wasn't as technically sophisticated as our urban high deployments, but it was more appropriate to the actual conditions where it needed to function. And it worked. Flood damage was reduced by 40%, evacuation times were cut in half, and emergency response became more effective because it was based on both technical predictions and local knowledge about community needs and capabilities. The success led to invitations to work on similar challenges in other parts of the world: drought management in sub-Saharan Africa, earthquake preparedness in remote mountain regions, disease outbreak response in communities with limited healthcare infrastructure. Each project taught me something new about the relationship between technological sophistication and practical effectiveness. The most advanced algorithms were useless if people couldn't access them or understand how to use them. But even simple integration of local knowledge with basic technological tools could produce dramatic improvements in outcomes. This work also brought me into contact with a global community of practitioners who were addressing similar challenges from different angles: appropriate technology advocates, participatory development specialists, community organizers, indigenous knowledge researchers. I realized that high methodology wasn't as innovative as I thought. People had been working on integrating different types of expertise for decades, often in contexts where technological solutions alone were insufficient. What was new was applying these approaches to high technology environments where the assumption had been that algorithmic solutions were inherently superior to human judgment. By demonstrating that integration worked better than replacement, even in sophisticated technical contexts, we'd opened space for broader conversations about the value of diverse expertise. But this realization also raised uncomfortable questions about privilege and access. High systems required resources, time, money, technical infrastructure, educated participants that weren't available to everyone who could benefit from better integration of human and algorithmic decision-making. Question of equity became central to everything I worked on. How do you ensure that the benefits of improved human algorithmic integration aren't concentrated among people who already have advantages? How do you make these approaches accessible to communities that have been excluded from technology development processes? These concerns were heightened during a project with the Department of Health and Human Services to improve food assistance distribution. Our high approach successfully optimized supply chains and reduced administrative costs, but it also revealed that the communities most in need of food assistance were least likely to have the resources necessary to participate in system improvement processes. We're making the system more efficient, said Janet Morrison, a community advocate in Detroit, but we're not making it more equitable. The same families who struggled to access services before are still struggling, even though the overall system performance is better. She was right. HAI methodology could improve system performance without addressing underlying inequalities in access and representation. In some cases, it might even exacerbate inequalities by giving more influence to participants who are already advantaged in terms of education, resources, and social connections. This recognition led to the development of what I called equity-centered integration ECI approaches that explicitly prioritized input from communities that were most affected by system failures but least represented in system design processes. ETI systems required additional resources and more complex coordination, but they produced more comprehensive improvements. Instead of just optimizing for efficiency or user satisfaction, they optimized for equitable outcomes across different populations. The Food Assistance Project was redesigned using ECHI principles, with extensive outreach to ensure that families experiencing food insecurity could participate in system improvement processes. Community meetings were held in multiple languages, childcare was provided, transportation assistance was offered, and participants were compensated for their time. The insights that emerged were different from what traditional user research would have captured. Families described not just what services they needed, but how interactions with bureaucratic systems affected their dignity, their children's school performance, and their relationships with neighbors and community members. These insights led to changes that went beyond technical optimization. Application processes were simplified, office hours were expanded, staff training included modules on trauma-informed service delivery, and community organizations were funded to provide navigation assistance. The results were measured not just in terms of administrative efficiency, but in terms of food security, family stability, and community resilience. The system became both more effective and more equitable, but it required sustained commitment to including voices that were typically excluded from policy development. Working on ITCHI projects was personally transformative. It forced me to confront how my own advantages, education, economic stability, professional networks, cultural capital had shaped my ability to advocate for different approaches to system design. I began including explicit discussions of privilege and equity in all my presentations and publications, not because I was an expert on these topics, but because they were inseparable from questions about whose knowledge gets valued and whose perspectives get incorporated into technological systems. This shift in focus attracted new audiences, but also created new tensions. Some technology leaders were uncomfortable with explicit discussions of equity, preferring to focus on technical optimization without addressing broader social implications. "Sarah, I appreciate your commitment to social justice," said one CEO after a conference presentation. "But shouldn't we focus on building the best possible systems first, and then worry about distribution and access issues later?" With respect, I replied, "Equity isn't something you add to systems after they're built. It's something you design into systems from the beginning. If you're not thinking about whose knowledge you're incorporating and whose needs you're prioritizing, you're making choices about equity whether you realize it or not." The conversation was part of a broader debate in the technology industry about the social responsibilities of technologists and the role of values in system design. I found myself at the center of discussions I'd never expected to be part of, speaking to audiences who were grappling with questions about the relationship between technical innovation and social justice. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. I received a letter from a group of delivery drivers in Seattle who'd heard about my work and wanted to share their own experiences with system optimization. "We've been following your career since we heard about the TechFlow presentation," they wrote. It's amazing to see someone who started where we are now making such a big impact. But we wanted you to know that drivers everywhere are still dealing with the same kinds of problems you identified years ago. We're using insights from your work to advocate for better systems in our own companies. The letter included detailed analyses of delivery optimization challenges at major shipping companies, along with proposed solutions based on driver expertise and high methodology. The insights were sophisticated and practical, demonstrating that the problem-solving approaches I developed were being adopted and adapted by people facing similar challenges. Reading their work, I was reminded of something I'd lost sight of during my transition into policy and academic circles: the importance of staying connected to the practical problems that had originally motivated my interest in better integration of human and algorithmic decision-making. I arranged to spend a week working with the Seattle drivers, learning about current challenges and testing new approaches to human algorithmic integration and delivery logistics. It was the first time in years that I'd done hands-on problem solving with people who were directly affected by the systems we were trying to improve. The experience was both nostalgic and educational. Many of the technical challenges were similar to what I'd encountered at TechFlow, but the social and economic context had evolved. Gig economy platforms had created new forms of algorithmic management that were more invasive and less transparent than the systems I'd originally worked with. The algorithms now track everything, explained Roberto, a driver who'd been working for multiple platforms for 3 years. Not just your location and delivery times, but your driving patterns, customer ratings, acceptance rates for different types of orders. They use all that data to make decisions about which drivers get the best opportunities. But we don't get to see the data or understand how the decisions are made. The week I spent with the Seattle drivers fundamentally changed my understanding of how high methodology needed to evolve. The algorithmic management systems they described were far more sophisticated than what I'd encountered at TechFlow, but they were also more opaque and less accountable. It's like being managed by a ghost, said Carmen, a driver who worked for 3 different delivery platforms simultaneously. The algorithm knows everything about your performance, but you can't talk to it, question its decisions, or understand why it treats some drivers differently than others. Their situation illustrated a crucial limitation in high systems as I'd originally conceived them. My work had focused on improving algorithmic decision-making by incorporating human expertise, but I'd assumed that humans would have some agency in the integration process. Gig economy platforms had created systems where algorithms incorporated human input through ratings, tracking data, and behavioral monitoring, but gave workers no voice in how that input was interpreted or used. It was human algorithmic integration without human agency or accountability. Working with the drivers, we developed what I called participatory algorithmic governance, PAG systems that gave workers meaningful input into the algorithmic systems that managed their labor. The approach started with transparency. Instead of black box algorithms that made decisions without explanation, PAG systems provided workers with clear information about how their data was being collected, what factors influenced algorithmic decisions, and how they could appeal or contest automated determinations. But transparency alone wasn't sufficient. Workers also needed mechanisms for participating in ongoing system development and refinement. This meant creating structured processes for collecting worker feedback about algorithmic decisions, identifying patterns of bias or error, and incorporating insights about operational realities that the algorithms missed. The pilot project focused on route optimization for a regional delivery service that was willing to experiment with more participatory approaches to algorithmic management. Instead of simply tracking driver performance and adjusting routes automatically, The system included interfaces that allowed drivers to provide input about route efficiency, customer preferences, and operational challenges. More importantly, it included governance structures that gave drivers collective voice in how the algorithmic systems evolved. Regular meetings brought together drivers, dispatchers, and system designers to review performance data, identify problems, and propose improvements. The results were striking. Route efficiency improved by 25%, driver satisfaction increased significantly, and customer complaints dropped by 40%. But perhaps most importantly, the adversarial relationship between workers and algorithmic management began to shift toward collaboration. For the first time in years, I feel like the system is working with me instead of against me, said Maria, one of the pilot participants. When I report a problem with a route or suggest a better approach, the algorithm actually learns from it instead of just flagging me for noncompliance. The success attracted attention from labor organizations, technology companies, and policy researchers who were grappling with similar challenges in other industries. Ride-sharing drivers, warehouse workers, content moderators, and freelancers in various fields were all dealing with algorithmic management systems that tracked their performance but gave them no voice in how those systems operated. I began consulting with labor unions and worker advocacy organizations to develop PIG approaches for different contexts. Each industry had unique challenges, but the underlying dynamic was similar: sophisticated algorithms that made decisions about people's livelihoods without meaningful input from the people most affected by those decisions. The work brought me into contact with a different set of experts than I'd worked with before: labor economists, industrial relations specialists, social movement organizers, and policy advocates focused on worker rights rather than technological innovation. Their perspectives challenged some of my assumptions about human algorithmic integration. While I've been focused on improving system performance through better incorporation of human expertise, they were focused on power dynamics and democratic participation in technological governance. The question isn't just whether algorithms make better decisions when they incorporate human input, explained Dr. Sarah Thompson, a labor economist at UC Berkeley. It's who gets to decide what counts as better and who benefits from algorithmic decision-making in the first place. Her critique forced me to think more carefully about the political dimensions of high methodology. Integration of human and algorithmic decision-making wasn't politically neutral. It reflected and reinforced particular distributions of power and authority. This realization led to the most challenging project of my career. The AFL-CIO asked me to develop recommendations for federal legislation that would guarantee workers' rights to participate in algorithmic systems that affected their employment. The project required me to navigate complex legal, economic, and political terrain that was far outside my original expertise. I had to understand labor law, regulatory frameworks, industry economics, and political coalition building, but it also required me to apply high methodology to the policy development process itself. Instead of working with legal experts and policy analysts in isolation, I organized integration forums that brought together workers, union leaders, technology executives, employment lawyers, and civil rights advocates. The conversations were intense and sometimes heated. Different stakeholders had fundamentally different interests and priorities. Workers wanted protection from arbitrary algorithmic decisions. Companies wanted flexibility to innovate and optimize their operations. Lawyers wanted clear, enforceable standards. Civil rights advocates wanted guarantees that algorithmic systems wouldn't perpetuate discrimination, but the integration process also revealed common ground that wouldn't have been apparent without structured dialogue across different perspectives. Everyone wanted algorithmic systems that were fair, transparent, and effective. The disagreements were primarily about how to achieve those goals, not whether they were worth pursuing. The final recommendations balanced worker protection with business flexibility, creating frameworks that required transparency and participation without prescribing specific technological approaches. Companies would be required to provide workers with information about algorithmic systems that affected their employment, opportunities to contest automated decisions, and mechanisms for providing input into system development. But the legislation also recognized that different industries and organizational contexts would require different implementation approaches. Instead of one-size-fits-all requirements, it established principles and oversight, mechanisms that could be adapted to various situations. The bill was introduced in Congress with bipartisan support, which surprised many observers who expected worker protection legislation to be purely partisan. But the integration forum process had produced recommendations that addressed conservative concerns about regulatory burden and liberal concerns about worker rights. During the congressional hearings on the bill, I found myself in the familiar position of defending unconventional approaches to complex problems. But this time, the stakes felt higher. The legislation could affect millions of workers across multiple industries, setting precedents for how democratic societies govern algorithmic systems. Chan, said Representative Johnson from Texas. Your bill would require companies to involve workers in algorithm development processes. But won't that slow down innovation and make American companies less competitive internationally? Representative Johnson, our research suggests that involving workers actually improves algorithmic performance and innovation, I replied. Have insights about operational realities that pure data analysis misses. Companies that incorporate worker expertise typically see better results, not worse ones. But the most powerful testimony came from workers who participated in PAG pilot projects. They spoke about the difference between being managed by incomprehensible algorithms and being able to participate in algorithmic systems that incorporated their expertise. Before the pilot project, I felt like I was fighting the algorithm every day, testified James Wright, a warehouse worker from Ohio. It would give me impossible targets, route me inefficiently, and punish me for factors beyond my control. After we implemented participatory governance, the system started working with me instead of against me. My productivity improved, my stress decreased, and I actually looked forward to coming to work. The Algorithmic Accountability in Employment Act passed both houses of Congress by comfortable margins and was signed into law 6 months later. It was the first federal legislation to explicitly address worker rights in algorithmic management systems, and it established principles that influence similar laws in other countries, but more than the policy victory. The process had demonstrated that high methodology could be applied to democratic governance itself. Complex policy challenges could benefit from structured integration of diverse expertise. Just like technological systems, this insight led to my current work developing what I call democratic integration processes approaches to public policy, development that systematically incorporate different types of knowledge and experience into decision-making instead of traditional policy development that relies primarily on expert analysis and stakeholder lobbying. Democratic integration creates structured opportunities for affected communities to participate directly in policy design. An evaluation. The approach has been applied to everything from climate change, adaptation to healthcare reform to criminal justice policy. Each application teaches us something new about how to balance technical expertise with lived experience, how to manage conflicts between different priorities and values, and how to create policies that work effectively in real-world conditions. But Perhaps the most significant impact has been on how I understand my own role and expertise. I no longer see myself as someone who has special insights about system optimization. Instead, I see myself as someone who's developed skills in facilitating integration of different types of knowledge and expertise. This shift in self-understanding has been personally liberating. Instead of feeling pressured to be an expert on everything, I can focus on creating processes that help actual experts collaborate more effectively. It's also led to new forms of collaboration and mentorship. I work with community organizers who understand social dynamics I've never experienced, with policy researchers who know legal and institutional frameworks I'm still learning, with technologists who have skills I'll never master, but I also work with delivery drivers, warehouse workers, restaurant staff, and other people whose expertise comes from doing complex work rather than studying it. Their insights remain as valuable and necessary as any formal credential or academic degree. Last month, I was invited back to TechFlow to speak at a company-wide meeting about the evolution of high methodology. Walking through the same building where I once delivered Chinese food, I was struck by how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. The 14th floor looked similar, but the culture was different. The engineering teams now included people with backgrounds in anthropology, sociology, and community organizing, alongside computer science and mathematics. Field research was a standard part of system development. Worker input was systematically incorporated into algorithmic design processes. Marcus, now the company's chief technology officer, introduced me with obvious pride. 10 years ago, Sarah was delivering food to this building and noticing problems with our systems that we couldn't see. Tonight, she's going to talk about how that experience led to fundamental changes in how we think about technology and human expertise. My presentation focused on lessons learned from a decade of working on human algorithmic integration across different contexts and scales. But the most important point was about the ongoing nature of this work. High methodology isn't a problem we solve once and then move on, I told the assembled employees. It's an ongoing commitment to recognizing that complex systems require different types of expertise, and that the people closest to problems often understand solutions that experts miss. After the presentation, a young engineer approached me with a question that brought everything full circle. Sarah, I'm working on optimizing food delivery systems for rural communities. The algorithms work fine in urban areas, but they're failing in small towns and remote regions. Do you have any advice? I smiled, remembering my own confusion when faced with similar challenges years earlier. Start by talking to the drivers, I said. Spend time with them, understand the problems they encounter that your algorithms don't account for. Then build systems that can learn from their expertise instead of ignoring it. But how do I know which insights to trust? How do I distinguish between valuable expertise and personal preferences or biases? It was the same question I grappled with throughout this journey: how to systematically incorporate human expertise while maintaining scientific rigor and accountability. Test everything, I replied. If incorporating a driver's insight improves system performance, that's evidence the insight is valuable. If it doesn't, that's evidence to look for different insights or different approaches. The validation comes from results, not credentials. And what if the results conflict with established best practices or theoretical frameworks? Then maybe the best practices and theoretical frameworks need to be updated. That's how knowledge advances, through confrontation with evidence that doesn't fit existing assumptions. Driving home that night, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from delivering Chinese food to addressing global policy challenges. The path had been unpredictable, often difficult, and sometimes overwhelming, but it had also been deeply meaningful. I've learned that expertise comes in many forms: that complex problems require diverse perspectives, and that the most sophisticated technical solutions are useless if they don't address real human needs. Most importantly, I've learned that the question, "You think you're smarter than us?" reflects a fundamental misunderstanding about how intelligence and expertise work. It's not about any individual being smarter than anyone else. It's about creating systems that combine different types of intelligence and expertise in ways that produce better outcomes for everyone. The delivery driver who notices patterns in failed routes isn't smarter than the engineer who designs optimization algorithms. The engineer isn't smarter than the driver. They have different types of expertise that become powerful when combined systematically rather than competing against each other. Understanding has shaped everything I've done since that first night when Marcus asked me to look at tech flows. Delivery system with fresh eyes. It's guided the development of HAI methodology, influenced federal legislation, and informed my work on democratic governance processes. But perhaps most importantly, it's changed how I think about my own story and what it represents. This isn't a tale about an individual overcoming obstacles through exceptional talent or insight. It's a story about what becomes possible when we create space for different types of expertise to contribute to solving complex problems. The systems I helped build at TechFlow weren't successful because I was uniquely gifted at understanding delivery logistics. They were successful because we created processes that could systematically incorporate insights from people who had been excluded. From system design decisions, the policy work wasn't effective because I became an expert on governance and regulation. It was effective because we developed approaches that brought together different types of experts, including people whose expertise came from being directly affected by the policies being discussed. The academic and professional recognition wasn't a validation of my individual brilliance. It was recognition of the value of approaches that integrate diverse forms of knowledge and expertise rather than privileging some and dismissing others. As I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Cotton in Bangladesh. "Sarah, the flood management system helped save over 200 lives during the season's monsoon. The integration of local knowledge with technical predictions made all the difference. Thank you for showing us that expertise comes in many forms." Reading her message, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from work that matters. Not because I had solved the problem alone, but because we had created systems that enabled different types of expertise to work together more effectively. Tomorrow, I would start work on a new project developing democratic integration processes for climate change adaptation planning. It would require bringing together climate scientists and community organizers, urban planners and indigenous knowledge holders, policy experts, and people whose communities were already experiencing the effects of rising seas and extreme weather. Work would be challenging, sometimes frustrating, and inevitably imperfect. There would be conflicts between different priorities and values, disagreements about methods and outcomes, and ongoing struggles to balance competing interests and needs. But there would also be moments of breakthrough, when insights from unexpected sources would illuminate solutions that no single type of expertise could have identified alone. There would be policies that worked better because they incorporated knowledge from people who would be most affected by their implementation. There would be systems that served human needs more effectively because they were designed with human expertise rather than despite it. Most importantly, there would be continued evidence that the question, "You think you're smarter than us?" misses the point entirely. The goal isn't to prove that any individual or group is smarter than any other. The goal is to create conditions where different types of intelligence and expertise can combine to address challenges that none of us could solve alone. 10 years ago, I was delivering Chinese food and watching engineers struggle with problems I thought I might be able to help solve. I never imagined that observation would lead to fundamental changes in how we think about expertise, technology, and democratic governance. But that's the nature of complex systems. Small changes can have large and unexpected consequences. A delivery driver's insight about address validation can evolve into new approaches to urban logistics, federal legislation protecting worker rights, and frameworks for democratic participation in an age of algorithmic decision-making. The story continues because the work is never finished. There will always be new problems that require different combinations of expertise, new challenges that existing approaches can address, new opportunities to bridge the gaps between technical solutions and human realities. And there will always be people whose expertise is undervalued or ignored, whose insights could contribute to better solutions. If we create systems that can recognize and incorporate their knowledge, the question isn't whether anyone is smarter than anyone else. The question is whether we're smart enough to build systems that help all of us become smarter together. That question has driven my work for the past decade, and it will continue to drive my work for whatever comes next. Because in a world of increasing complexity and interconnectedness, our ability to solve problems will depend not on individual brilliance, but on our capacity to integrate different types of expertise in service of common goals. The Chinese food I once delivered has long since been consumed. The delivery routes I once drove have been optimized and re-optimized countless times. The engineers I once brought meals to have moved on to new companies and new challenges. But the fundamental insight that emerged from those interactions that complex problems require diverse expertise, and that the people closest to problems often understand solutions that experts miss, continues to shape how we approach everything from urban planning to artificial intelligence to democratic governance. It's an insight that belongs not to any individual, but to all of us who are working to create systems that serve human needs more effectively. And it's a reminder that expertise and intelligence come in many forms, all of which have something valuable to contribute to the challenges we face together. The story of how a delivery driver fixed what 30 engineers couldn't is really a story about what becomes possible when we stop asking who's smarter than whom and start asking how we can all become smarter together. That transformation from competition to collaboration, from exclusion to integration, from individual brilliance to collective intelligence, is the real fix that our complex world needs. As I write this final reflection, 5 years have passed since the Algorithmic Accountability and Employment Act became law, and 3 years since the United Nations adopted the global framework for democratic integration in technology governance. The principles we developed through decades of work on human algorithmic integration have influenced policies and practices around the world. But the most meaningful changes have been smaller and more personal. Yesterday, I received an email from a young woman named Jennifer who's working as a hospital custodian while studying computer science at night. She wrote that she'd identified inefficiencies in the hospital's patient transport scheduling system and was trying to convince the IT department to listen to her ideas. They keep telling me I don't have the right qualifications to understand their system, she wrote. But I see every day how the scheduling creates problems for patients, families, and staff. I read about your work and wanted to ask, how do you get people to take your insights seriously when you don't have the credentials they expect? Her question brought me back to that first night in TechFlow's conference room when I had to defend my right to contribute insights about systems I understood better than their creators. The question of credentials versus competence, formal education versus practical expertise, algorithmic sophistication versus human understanding, I wrote, back with the same advice I'd given to hundreds of people over the years. Focus on results, not credentials. Document the problems you observe, propose specific solutions, and test them whenever possible. Find allies who are willing to listen and experiment. Most importantly, remember that your perspective has value precisely because it's different from the people who design the system. But I also acknowledge something I couldn't have understood when I was starting out. Be prepared for a long journey. Changing how institutions think about expertise and authority takes time, patience, and persistence. There will be setbacks and disappointments along with breakthroughs and victories. Jennifer's email reminded me that the work of integrating different types of expertise into complex systems is ongoing, generational, and ultimately collective. Each person who speaks up about problems they observe, who insists that their knowledge has value, who creates space for others to contribute, their insights advances the broader project of building more inclusive and effective approaches to problem solving. The impact extends far beyond technology and policy. In schools, teachers are incorporating student insights into curriculum design. In hospitals, janitors and cafeteria workers are contributing to patient safety initiatives. In city government, community members are participating directly in budget planning and service delivery optimization. These changes reflect a fundamental shift in how we think about expertise and authority. The assumption that formal credentials guarantee competence and that people without credentials have nothing valuable to contribute is being replaced by more nuanced understandings of how knowledge works and where insights come from. This shift hasn't been without resistance or complications. There are legitimate concerns about maintaining professional standards, ensuring quality control, and preventing the authority of expertise from being undermined by populist anti-intellectualism. But the evidence from thousands of projects, policies, and initiatives is clear. Systems work better when they incorporate diverse types of expertise rather than excluding them. The challenge is creating structures and processes that can systematically capture valuable insights while maintaining appropriate standards and accountability. That challenge will continue evolving as technology advances and social conditions change. Artificial intelligence systems are becoming more sophisticated, but they still struggle with context, values, and the kind of tacit knowledge that comes from lived experience. Democratic institutions are grappling with increased polarization and distrust, but they're also experimenting with new forms of participation and deliberation. The principles of human algorithmic integration, transparency, participation, accountability, equity, and continuous learning provide frameworks for navigating these challenges, but they must be adapted and refined for new contexts and applications. Looking ahead, I see tremendous opportunities for applying these approaches to global challenges that require coordination across different scales, sectors, and types of expertise. Climate change adaptation, pandemic preparedness, economic inequality, technological governance, all of these issues will benefit from better integration of scientific knowledge, policy analysis, community wisdom, and practical experience. But success will depend on our ability to move beyond the question, who's smarter than whom, toward the more productive question, how can we become smarter together? That shift in mindset from competition to collaboration, from exclusion to integration, from individual brilliance to collective intelligence, is the foundation for everything else. The Chinese food I delivered 10 years ago was just food. The delivery routes I drove were just routes. The inefficient algorithms I encountered were just code. But the relationships between food delivery drivers and software engineers, between practical problems and technical solutions, between excluded expertise and institutional authority, those relationships contain the seeds of fundamental changes in how we approach complex challenges. Those seeds have grown into new approaches to technology design, policy development, and democratic governance. They've influenced federal legislation, international frameworks, and countless individual decisions about whose knowledge matters and how it should be incorporated into systems that affect all of our lives. But perhaps most importantly, they've demonstrated that transformation is possible when we create space for different types of expertise to contribute to solving problems that matter. The delivery driver who notices patterns and system failures isn't challenging the authority of engineers, she's offering to help them build better systems. The community organizer who questions policy assumptions isn't undermining expert analysis. He's providing context that makes expert analysis more accurate and effective. You think you're smarter than us? Assumes that intelligence and expertise are zero-sum resources, that valuing one type of knowledge requires devaluing others. But the real world doesn't work that way. Intelligence and expertise are complementary resources that become more powerful when combined systematically rather than competing against each other. That insight, learned through years of delivering Chinese food and watching smart people struggle with solvable problems, has shaped a decade of work on creating systems that serve human needs more effectively. It will continue shaping the work for decades to come as new challenges emerge and new opportunities arise for integrating different types of knowledge and expertise. The story of how a delivery driver fixed what 30 engineers couldn't is really a story about what becomes possible when we stop asking who's smarter than whom and start asking how we can all become smarter together. That transformation from individual competition to collective intelligence is the real solution our complex world needs, and it's a solution that belongs to all of us, because we all have expertise worth contributing to the challenges we face together.